Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate Peter Balakian's latest collection of poems, No Sign. I'm Olivia Katranjian, the founder of the International Armenian Literary Alliance, and I'm so happy to be working with our friends at the Armenian Institute to bring you this reading and discussion between two of the Armenian literary community's acclaimed creative minds. Thank you so much to Tata Vikayvazian at the Armenian Institute for co-hosting this event with us. It's always a pleasure to work with you. To our audience, please leave your questions for Peter in the chat. I'm really happy to have Alan Semerdjian hosting this discussion today because he's been a reader and student of Peter's work for a long time. And hopefully this will continue a conversation these poets have been having with their work for many years. Our host, Alan, is a writer, musician, artist, and educator. His music includes several collections of critically acclaimed albums, most recently Quiet Songs for Loud Times, which you can listen to on his website on repeat, as I do too often. He's the author of the chapbook, An Improvised Device, and the poetry collection In the Architecture of Bone, which Peter himself said these dynamic poems mingle the ghosts of the past with the pace of contemporary life, which you may say about the poems of No Sign as well. Alan recorded his poetry and that of other Armenian poets, including Peter, over the music of Peter Balakian in the spoken word album, The Serpent and the Crane. He has taught English and creative writing in public education for 25 years. He's the director of IALA's Young Armenian Poets Awards, through which he works tirelessly to encourage our next generation of Armenian poets. Alan, I will let you take the floor.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Tato. I'm grateful to be asked to introduce Peter today. And I know I'm not alone when I say we're all appreciative of the International Armenian Literary Alliance and the Armenian Institute coming together for today's event. I think it's a wonderful, productive union, and may it continue to blossom. Peter Balakian is the author of 8 books of poems, most notably Ozone Journal, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016. June Tree, which is his expansive and new and selected poems, 1974 to 2000. And of course, the collection whose release we're here to celebrate today, No Sign, which the Ukrainian-American poet Ilya Kaminsky has called utter beauty and a splendid and necessary book. Although well anthologized and highly acclaimed as a poet around the world, many readers came to know Peter's work through his prose. His memoir, Black Dog of Fate, won the Penn Martha Albrand Award in 1998 and was a New York Times notable book. And The Burning Tigress, which was and still is for many a kind of fulcrum for the study of the Armenian Genocide and America's response, won the 2005 Raphael Lemkin Prize and was a New York Times bestseller and a New York Times notable book. Peter has been translated often and has been a translator as well for a book of Siamantos poems and Armenian Golgotha, a memoir of the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1918 by his great uncle, Grigoris Balakian. 2015's Vice and Shadow, if I may put in a plug, is a sharp and insightful collection of essays on the lyric imagination, poetry, art, and culture. That's really show the reach of Balakian's intellect and vision as a thinker and maker. I want to also say that throughout it all, Peter has been a committed educator. He is the Donald M. and Constance H. Rebar Professor in Humanities in the Department of English at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York, which is where I met him almost 3 decades ago at the Shenango Valley Writers Conference. So I applied because my uncle Nubar said to me very directly, if you really want to be a poet, Alan, you need to study with one of our best. So I knew then, and can confirm it again now, many years later, that I, along with many other young Armenian and non-Armenian writers and students of the world, are better for our time spent with one of our best. It is my great pleasure and deep honor to introduce Peter Balakian.
Okay, there I am unmuted. Alan, thank you. And Tatavik and Olivia, thank you for your work and for creating community and culture, which we need on this planet more than ever. I mean, these are really dire times. And we can talk about those dire times if you'd like in our Q&A. But what you're doing with the Armenian Literary Alliance and the Armenian Institute in London matters in many ways, in many levels, in many layers. And art matters. We can talk more about that. Alan, thank you. Poet, musician, songwriter, teacher, you cover so much ground. And I'm glad to be back in dialogue with you on poems as we have been recently. And it's a pleasure to have you here doing this conversation with me. It seems like a couple of days ago we were meeting on the Colgate campus, but something about time that's kind of hard to comprehend. It was a while back. So what I want to do today is, in a way, introduce my new book of poems, No Sign. I'm always keen to discuss why poems matter and how to read them. So I'm not going to go there. I'm going to read my poems, but I'm happy to circle back to what poems do, why they matter, what they mean. So we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, with all of you before we're through today. Let me start with a poem called Yellow Lilies. We live in the imagination, whether we're artists or not, whether we're writers or visual artists, or we're people in all walks of life. The imagination defines our beings, and it can transform the world. Imagination can transform the world. And imagination is the source of our own inner life. This is called Yellow Lilies. Looking up, a galaxy is any star skidding into black. A black hole is my love. Who knows what's in the next cushion of air? What if a hole is just a Greek urn or Sarah's paint stick spiral? It's past midsummer and specks of light are wings of giant birds. I'll hang my torn soul on that. Take the flash of a star, the white line of a plane. Hear the ocean sound of words, hum blaring horn of wind. When I wake in gray light, black rocks, cardinals, yellow lilies, cumulonimbus. The grass is drying on me. A deer's eyes burn through the pines. Another poem that in a way engages imagination outside Arshil Gorky's studio. Gorky, we would probably all agree, means a lot to Armenians worldwide because of his particular forays into visual media and Armenian cultural experience. But he is, in the end, a great maker of color and a great draftsman, and that's why he appeals to the world. This poem is dedicated in my book to Adam Agoyan, my good friend and fellow maker of imagination, outside Arshil Gorky's studio. Buying organic honey and a slab of blue at the open market, Union Square, late day. Look up to see that number 36 is covered over by a storefront selling high-tech stuff. and a light drizzle coats my head. And through the streetlights, I see a church down the block that jogs me to the big lake and the Armenian church your mother used to take you to. It's still in Turkey. When I took some cell phone snaps of the carved walls as the morning sun, like Phaeton's chariot, lit up the Madonna and Child on the east facade that you worked over so many times till your brush was down to nothing. The 29 crash, bread lines, bullet holes in glass doors. Why stretch canvases in the daylight of bad times? Your friend said you scrubbed your studio floor with Lysol till it blanched. Canvases raw, scraped, linen. Wasn't it Hegel who said beauty was an expression of some sort of freedom? All roads lead to Union Square. Nightmares scoured by day, turpentine evaporating by night. This is a poem that comes out of some lived experience. Poems are not, I always remind my students and audiences, poems are not memoirs, they're not autobiographies, they are acts of imagination. They can be inflected by personal experiences, they can riff on personal experiences, take off on them. This poem came out of an event that happened to me in an artist colony, the great artist colony, Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, where I've spent many summers as a resident working on my books, finishing books. One of my colleagues that summer, an African-American poet named Dolores Kendrick, Dolores is no longer living, wonderful person. After some spirited conversations we were having about one of my heroes, and certainly one of her heroes, James Baldwin, she said to me, you know, I speak to Jimmy once or twice a week. You may know he's dying of cancer and living in the south of France in a small village. Why don't you come and say hello to him on the phone? In those days, now we're back in the mid-1980s, remember telephone booths, those weird things? I miss them. I went into the telephone booth where we used to make those calls to the outside world, and I said a few words to James Baldwin. This poem, which opens my book, I suppose I could say deals with dislocations and strange, unpredictable connections. My great uncle, Peter Balakian, who wrote this extraordinary two-volume Armenian Genocide survivor memoir, Armenian Golgotha, was at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And many of you in this audience know that Armenia was trying to make a stand for a nation. The other events in this, the other historical events will be self-evident. History, bitterness. A phone booth, August, Yaddo, Saratoga Springs. Air of the Tiffany parlor. Sour scent of empty wine bottles. My friend handed me the sweating receiver. Go ahead, say hello. What could I say to James Baldwin, who was dying in the south of France? No name in the street, Paris, Algiers, Little Rock. You can fill it in. I'm sitting at Les Deux Magots with my NY Yankees umbrella in my lap, a wide glass of wine from a vineyard of Burgundy in my hand, recalling that Baldwin sat here, drinking scotch all day and writing as friends dropped by. And it hits me. Just over Pont de Sully, my great uncle sat in a big treaty room in 1919, representing Armenia. Did it exist? In a fancy hotel with others who hoped for a nation in return for the slaughter. Baldwin knew Sartre and de Beauvoir. He saw Camus pass by. It was 1958, and the Algerian cabbie who dropped him off drunk on the curb was half blind from the revolution. Bang, bang, bang goes the heart. Mr. Baldwin was dying in a sensual village in the south of France. After a week at Versailles, my uncle came to that hotel room where in the closet of his head, a big white sheet floated over the Black Sea. What did rape and massacre mean? Fail-proof, shattered, bitten off words that floated over the bridge into the carnival horns of night. A few months earlier, Miles Davis passed Baldwin at Les Deux Magots on his way to play for Louis Malle's Ascenseur pour l'échafaud. The spurting love, the spurting air of love, 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 slipping from the valves, the spit and breath of night in Paris off the torpid brown Seine where Paul Celan had disappeared not long before. Hiss, hiss, hiss goes the heart. It's 1958 and Camus still walks the boulevard. The war in Algeria is daily acid on the river. What are degrees of separation? Private myths, illusions? My aunt, the surrealist, might call them chance meetings. Do we invent proximities for our need, for salvation, for love? Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, names my uncle scrawled on a map of the dispossessed on a wall in a hotel of cards where Dixieland horns played at a banquet for the Grande Armée. And the next map of Europe was shuffled with an ace in the hole. Miles Davis spent 7 hours with Louis Malle making some languid, piercing, hollow, sliding sounds in the indeterminate, dank night. No name on the street stalked him. A few years later, Baldwin moved just miles from where my father was born in Istanbul. A few years after the Armenians were expunged from Turkey and my grandparents left the ghost map on the wall. It was 1919, and the flu blew along Saint-Germain, where my grandparents met my uncle that fall. I knew Baldwin's heart went hollow, languid, and sizzled with the need to get out of America. It even led him to the place my grandparents fled before they landed a couple of miles from Baldwin's apartment in Harlem. Are these degrees of separation, or just my way of thinking about that strange moment in a phone booth at an artist colony in the summer of '86? My friend said, if you love Jimmy's work, I know he'd love to hear from you. All good news means a lot, especially at the end. What could I say to Mr. Baldwin? He'd helped me understand the bitter history that had trapped me, that was trapped in me. Istanbul, New York, Paris, no name, no street. I was sweating into the phone. Mr. Baldwin's voice was frail, but unmistakable. There's a section in this book. All writing is a great act of pleasure. It's almost, I can say at this point, having done it for many decades, it's like a drug. It's just a high. It's a high to make the language. And then it takes whatever it takes to do your 100 revisions, whatever, to get it where you want. But I had I had a special pleasure writing this group of poems that are kind of object lessons or meditations on fruits and vegetables. And the object lesson, the meditation, the ode in a way, if you will, was exciting because you don't know where you're going and it's taking you somewhere. And that somewhere was often a historical place, but it never lost the sense of the beauty of the fruit or the vegetable or the food or the cuisine. In these poems, often my mother is in the kitchen, still going strong at 90, almost 95. She is still a connoisseur of the culinary art. This poem is called Eggplant. I love the white moon circles and the purple halos on a plate as the salt sweat them. The oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert, when a moon stayed all day, when morning was a purple elegy for the last friend seen, when the fog of the riverbank rose like a holy ghost. My mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. Some parsley appeared from the garden, and summer evenings came with no memory, but the table with white dishes, shining aubergine, black-skinned beauty, bitter apple, we used our hands. Still, many books later, my grandmother, Nafina, my maternal grandmother, who was the only survivor of her large and prosperous family from Diyarbakir, today southeast Turkey, once historic Armenia, once northern Mesopotamia, still is. My grandmother, who survived with her two infant daughters, my aunts Alice and Gladys, then Zivart and Arsha Lois, has continued to be an animating force in my imagination. Some of you know from reading Black Dog of Fate that memoir is really her story, more than mine, I feel, even though it is my coming of age story. And my grandmother's kind of persona and voice inhabits various poems over the years. So she continues to percolate, and she percolates in this book as well. And even in that poem, Eggplant, those evocations of Death March experience appear in their way. This next poem I want to read is called Matzah. Now, I said fruits and vegetables, but this is the one bread poem in the cycle. And my first kind of best friend from my young childhood, when we were living in Teaneck, New Jersey, before we moved to Tenafly, was Mark Schwartz. And I fictionalized Mark to Alan in this poem. And if I get to reprint the poem later in a collection, I'll return it to his name, Mark. I want him fully in this poem. I didn't see Mark much after we left Teaneck, moved to the neighboring town of Tenafly. I was 9 years old, but in 1973, Mark was shot out of the sky in a helicopter over the Sinai Peninsula in the Yom Kippur War with Egypt. And that event really shook me up. It was that experience of mortality that you have when a childhood friend is no longer, and you're all still, 22 or 23 years old. Matzah. Sometimes when I look up at the moon, I think of Alan Schwartz, in whose kitchen I sat on Passover. We were the only Christians on the block, eating corrugated sheets of bread, though it didn't feel like bread. In the evening, the moon's white light followed me home. I didn't understand what God commanded the Jews to do. At the Formica counter before the Seder, we crunched on the mother of all wafers. Out of Egypt, there was moonlight over the stillness, crisp and sweet to the tongue. Was this the bread of affliction? Years later, when Alan was shot out of the sky over the Sinai, I asked the moon, what was the no yeast of freedom? I walked for days to get to the Red Sea because Exodus led to Deuteronomy. Even now, when I'm shivering at the water's edge, the sky no more blue than ash over trees. The difference between prophecy and law is the difference between the moon and the sea. The end of the body is one half of death, the absence of moonlight, the other. There's a long 45 section poem in the middle of No Sign. And the title of that poem is No Sign. And it's the third in the 45 section long poems that have appeared in my last 3 books. These constitute for me a trilogy, and I hope they will come out as one long poem before long. I'm interested in the long poem as a form. The non-narrative lyric sequential long poem I regard as particularly an American form. Obviously, long poems are ancient in more narrative forms from, the Iliad on. But the lyric multi-section long poem I mark as starting with Whitman's great Song of Myself, a lyric epic poem in 52 sections. If you don't know it, please read it. It defines something about not only the USA experience, but the human experience universally. In No Sign, an estranged couple comes back together in a meeting on the New Jersey Palisade Cliffs, where they encounter each other in a complex dialogue that twines and intertwines and weaves a conversation about the geological history of the Earth, the Vietnam War, Alain Resnais, it's a great film, Hiroshima Mon Amour, and other things. Okay, I hope you will find it an interesting wrestle. So I want to read just a couple sections so you get I don't do this often, but today it seemed like it would be fun to introduce the long poem in the middle of this book. He and she, I will just read it as it's marked, and I'll read a few of the opening sections. 1, he, is it night already? She, no. He, did our house fall down? She, what happened? He, is it you? 2, he, yes. She, why should I believe you? He, doesn't geology put us in our place? He, we appeared in the age of fission, vaporized bodies, ionized dragonflies, shadows printed on stone. She, Japanese cities burned in my dreams. I saw the newsreels in class decades later. He, we're back here on the Palisade Cliffs, staring at Manhattan. Remember when the Sauterne was liquid gold? 3, she, In the beginning, there were alpha particles and gamma rays. We always see daylight through the kitchen window near dusk. We can't forget how dusk turns the hydrangea deep blue. We can't forget the glowing dioxin sun, the no gaze, morning bright blue agent, orange sky, even now, after all. 4. Godard called Hiroshima Mon Amour, Faulkner plus Stravinsky. She, remember, at the Angelica, September smell of light rain, warm sidewalks, shop awnings, late summer. The Noren curtains opened, the Noren curtains closed. We stared at kanji, birds, sketches of roofs, a tree. The lovers walked through the curtains either way. Time shifted like breeze through eye sockets. They said goodbye and the Noren curtains opened, and the past was a burning city, seen in silence, just images on screen. Louis, what did Hiroshima mean to you? L, the end of the war, fear and terror that it could happen to us. Then indifference, astonishment that they dared do it. Then it became an unknown fear. Let me close with 2 poems. After many hesitations and fears and uncertainties and anxieties, I finally went to Turkey. And I went 4 times between 2013 and 2015. This was made possible because of so many of my courageous Turkish friends. Taner Akçam, for example, made my first trip secure and safe. I don't think it could happen today. Turkey has become a state of terror. And we all know our dear friend Osman Kavala is in prison now with a life sentence. It's unthinkable and hard to even utter. Osman did so much for my trips to Turkey during those 4 years. I gave public readings, lectures from Bogazici University to art galleries in Beyoğlu to a reading in a vegan cafe in Diyarbakir in late May of 2015 with my whole family there with me. It was an extraordinary, one of the great events of my life, that we were all there as a family. That was the last trip I made to Turkey with the great Armin Aroyan, who was our guide. And I began thinking about the ghosts that were haunting me, and they were haunting all of us, and the ghosts of our dead ancestors. And after the Armenian Genocide, there was only one cousin left in Turkey, our cousin Murat, who's still alive in Istanbul. And this is my father's family, my father's cousin. He's a Panosian. My grandmother's family, wealthy industrialists who lived in Scutari until their coal mines and business were confiscated by the Turkish state after World War I. So this poem is trying to deal with that strange experience of returning to your ancestral home, one of them, knowing everyone's gone, everyone's exiled or murdered. Yes, there is one cousin, but coming to, excuse me, coming to Istanbul, follow the gaze of Athena down a cistern where water glows. Follow silver snakes along Marmara and Golden Horn. Walk over the black plaque for Hrant Dink smack in the street in Shishli. Follow the ferry waves to Uskadar, where your father was born, where your uncle returned incognito from prison. Drink the split bourbon voice of Ray Charles in the cafe in Taksim under the red flags of star and moon, guns to the head, wild prayer, streets banging with pots and pans, rage at the dictator. Walk by in oblivion and terror. An American, an Armenian, black shirt under the olive trellis restaurant, hotel rooftop light rinsed Bosphorus, hot rocky fumes in the throat under the wind umbrellas and boutique glass facades of Beyoğlu, galleries of blue mosaics, magenta carpets. The Ottoman historian pours you tan and wine into the sunset. Follow the lights on the bridge into the chandelier of the sky, trompe l'oeil of gray wolves, voices of Turkish friends in the stone. Follow ghost signs, midnight cabs, smashed cafe windows, night sea journey of beloveds. Byzantine dirt smoke roads past tobacco regie and sultana crates. Hyder Pasha of Armenian soul, death hour. Lost family, come greet me in your city. And to close with a love poem. The bottom line for everything. And color and sensuality and fruits and love. I hope you'll find in abundance in this book that has darkness as well. How much I love you. How much I love you, because your shadow walks through the wall, because my heart is a double beat, because throbbing moves around the room the way floaters spin across the eye, because the pale green of wet grass, because the confusion of new leaves, because the brush strokes are blue, because buds of azaleas spread across lawns, because daylight is water. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a remarkable, evocative, and artful set of poems, bringing together so many things. We're going to climb into the phone booth for a minute, as you said, and talk about what poems do, as you said, and how they matter, and indeed the dire times, maybe even get to the love poems. I will invite readers, as I think somebody did earlier, Tatavik did, or Olivia did on the chat. If something strikes you and you want us to sort of circle back to that, please put it in the chat. Maybe a line from one of Peter's poems, or something that comes up in our discussion, which I'm imagining might be 15, 20 minutes or so. And then we want to sort of move towards the conversations and questions that are brought up in the chat. And Tatavik will kind of help me with that as well. So into the phone booth, Peter, if it's okay. Um, well, your work for me has always lived in that field between the ephemeral and the very sort of real and palpable. Right, sort of lived in between those two fields. So when there is a kind of a loose narrative in the work, which we just heard in that set, maybe there's a place, some sort of focus. It is often infused or sometimes taken over by what I'm going to call imagination's lift and transformation. The great American poet Wallace Stevens spoke about this phenomenon in the book of essays. I'm imagining you know it, or maybe some people know it, The Necessary Angel. And he called it, he talked about how the real is constantly being engulfed in the unreal. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk a bit about this balance in your work, particularly in No Sign, where I think you see it throughout, where this sort of real is engulfed in the unreal. And then also, if you can, how it may or may not be connected to accessibility in a poem, and then where a poem may go because of kind of elliptical language.
Right. Thank you, Alan. Yeah, let me say things just briefly. I think one of the joys of all reading and viewing experiences for readers in any art is just wrestling with the text. I don't want to interfere with that process for readers of my work. I guess maybe I would perhaps riff off your word unreal and say, maybe suggest more I don't know if metaphysical is the right, but conceptual, from the granular to the metaphysical, or the granular to the conceptual, the place where the poem meets the idea, meets ideas, where the granular intersects with notions of time and space, things I'm interested in. And so my particular mode of working often is to engage the relationship between the granular, the stuff of the material world. Doesn't have to be historical. It can be the roots of a begonia, or the rocks in your garden, or the bird shit on your window, whatever, the granular material world, and then to find places of shifting perspective where the poem can move to more conceptual, philosophical, or metaphysical places. Are these degrees of separation? What are degrees of separation? This kind of thing. What are propinquities? Is this just my way of coming to terms with being in a phone booth in an artist colony in the summer of 1980? I'm trying to examine meaning. I want the poem to examine some of its own meaning in a referential way. And so I find those gear shifts necessary for what I want the poem to do. I think poems can do many things. I like to work in layers. I like poems to have layers. And that's my way of, there's no answer to what one wants the poem to do. Different poets want their poems to do different things, but I like to work between the granular and the conceptual.
I saw that in the poem, I think it's Tung Lai Shun, where there's that motion of this memory of the restaurant, right?
Yeah.
And then you kind of move out from there. And of course, the head of Anahit in the collection as well, in No Sign, which I hope everybody's getting a chance to read, because I think both of those poems do that. They sort of take the granular, as you said, and then kind of move into or apply, I guess, the active imagination, which is what the phrase you used earlier. And that's when we go for that ride as readers. and I think when the poem is most successful, we're sustained in that ride throughout, and it's just, I see that in this collection on a really high level. I really appreciate that, Peter.
I'm glad you brought up Tung Lai Shun. I want to say to all readers out there who like Szechuan and Hunan cooking, I hope you'll find Tung Lai Shun an interesting encounter, both with cuisine and with art and poetry, because it's a poem about poetry.
It's a great one. I want to talk a little bit about the section 2 as well, which is the, as you said, the kind of ode-like meditations. I think that's section 2, yeah, on foods. It reminded me of this kind of strange marriage between Kenneth Koch has a book, New Addresses, which is all these dedications and odes to different things, piano lessons, different kinds of skeletons in our closet. But also I think that has a kind of whimsy, that book, whereas yours, I think, has a kind of sensuality in it, a real intimacy that reminds me also of Neruda's Book of Questions, and just Neruda in general. Can you just talk briefly about how did these fruits and vegetables kind of come to live together in No Sign, and also this particular thing? Do we need sometimes a kind of neutral point or just a space to serve as a conduit for the examination of deeper trauma? In other words, do we need a point, whether it's an eggplant or some sort of you said an object lesson, for us to sort of go from there into these deeper examinations of, difficult things? And then if you can, maybe read Pomegranate. I think that's one of my favorite ones from that section.
Sure. I really, I was reading Paul McCartney's, the big 2-volume lyrics that came out last fall. It's a really marvelous book. I recommend it. And he's writing in very crisp, clear terms about songwriting, and he's noting that when I start a song, I never know where it's going. It's always a mystery. And I just read that and said, nodding, yeah, of course, that's a truism. I don't write fiction, so I don't want to speak for fiction writers, but it's you never know where you're going to go. You have a strong impulse to begin, and something has drawn you to a cluster of words and some sounds and rhythms, and you start writing the poem. And I was drawn to thinking about the pleasurable beauty and joy of these fruits and vegetables, of eating and dining and cooking and all of that, basic human life experience. So I didn't really, I didn't know these poems were going to, some of them leap to darker places. And some of those places did end up, because some of the fruits and vegetables are very Anatolian and Near Eastern, Middle Eastern. They're not only Armenian, but if you are Armenian, you've seen them in your kitchen, or you've used, someone in your family has cooked with them, quince, walnut, pomegranate, eggplant. They don't belong to any particular culture, but I grew up with those things around me, and they're sources of fascination and beauty and good taste, and then that they led me in some cases to evocations of the tragic Armenian past. These things were surprises, they energized me in the writing, and they gave texture and layering to the meditation. And so that's always something one's happy when it happens, in the poem.
Can you read, if you can, if you don't mind, read Pomegranate for us, which I think, shifts into all sorts of, layers of, as you said, maybe the darker
Sure.
memories, but I think does so in such a impactful and honest way, I think. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, this poem's dedicated to my cousin Lynn Derderian, and Lynn and Karen, both my cousins, to whom I've dedicated two of these fruits and vegetables poems in this section. Lynn and Karen's mother, my Aunt Alice, was one of the two toddler infants on my grandmother's death march, a walk. Pomegranate. Persephone ate you and went to hell. My grandmother walked with you under her blouse, her two daughters hobbling with her. Every day, one seed for each of them. Whatever death road they walked down, you were seed apple, garnet, cochineal, spiritus ovum, spiraling hawk dive of the soul, leather red skin for hard times. Sometimes she looked up at the moon and saw you.
Thank you. Ron Jansen said on the chat, hi Ron, the exploratory approach is true of a way of painting also. And I think a lot of the poems in No Signs are these kinds of paintings in a way, never knowing where it's going at the start. Peter, I wanted to bring up this notion of poetry of witness, because I think that one of the ways that many people have come to your work is through that lens. I'm thinking about Carolyn Forché's seminal anthology, Against Forgetting, just a terrific, important text in which your work appears as part of the section devoted to the Armenian Genocide. In the introduction to that book, she attempts to define the term poetry of witness, and she writes this. She says, in thinking about these poems, I realized that the arguments between poetry and politics had been too narrowly defined. And she talks about, regardless of subject matter, these poems bear the traces of extremity within them, and they are, as such, evidence of what has occurred. And she goes on a bit to talk about language as well. But, if you may, just for a few minutes, to what extent and in what ways is No Sign in addition to this conversation around poetry of witness?
Well, yeah, I'm so grateful to my friend Carolyn for her anthology, and grateful to have been able to put together the small opening section on poets of the Armenian Genocide. Tekayan is in there, and Siamanto's in there. I can't remember if there are other poets in there, but anyway, I'm very grateful that anthology exists. Came out in the early 1990s, so it's now kind of a staple. It's no longer a kind of controversial new kind of anthology. I think it's, witness has come to be a term that signifies the imagination's experience with violence, and often mass violence, because there are other kinds of violence beside mass violence. And Lord knows, living in a society that is in such trouble as American culture is and life today, we live in a daily world of mass shootings, and we have a whole political party that refuses to acknowledge reality that is living in cowering dishonesty and fear. I'm talking about, of course, the Republican Party. It's a disgrace and an outrage to the very foundations of democracy. And so let me just circle to that for a second and then come back to the point of the imagination and violence and mass violence. We live in so much violence in the 21st century. And writers, poets in particular in this case, but writers and artists and musicians are constantly grinding up and transforming the experience of the world as it happens to them into their art. Not all poets need go to those places. Poets go anywhere. Poets go many different places. But there's certainly a very long tradition of the poet's imagination being inseparable from historical violence, politics, and mass trauma, Greek tragedy, the great Homeric epics deal with these matters. And I think that in a way, there came to be at a certain point in the late 19th century and perhaps early part of the 20th century, an unnatural demarcation between something that might have been called the aesthetic or metaphysical domain and the granular historical domain. I think these are artificial distinctions. I think many kinds of artists inhabit both worlds in the course of their work. Yeats is a good example. Auden is a good example. Adrienne Rich is a good example. Gwendolyn Brooks is a good example. Robert Lowell. So many poets whose cement mixer imaginations wrestle with the historical, the political, the violent, the beautiful, the erotic, the sensual, all of it in a flow of a life's work. So yeah, poems can flash a light on harsh and violent realities, and maybe we use the word witness to signify that. I think so much of experience is political that it really has to do with how a poet approaches it rather than the subject of the approach. I mean, rather than the material. Material is there. What you do with it is what matters. So I've always been interested in some of the grisly and edgy and harsh violence of the world that defines us. Only because, like many writers, I'm interested in the world, and that's part of it. There are poets who don't want to go there, and that's fine. You know, Mallarmé really didn't want to go there, and he's a great poet, but you know.
When I met Yevgeny Yevtushenko once, who passed years back, but the Russian writer at the Walt Whitman house once, and he told me that the poets, he said there's going to come a time when poets will become I think he said the truest journalists of our time, which I thought was an interesting thing to think about. And we know many journalists who obviously do incredible work, but it's, as you said, it's a different kind of flashing a light.
Yeah, I mean, journalism operates out of a different kind of language, and poets, I don't think, don't write in that kind of language, in that kind of form or genre. But the idea that poems can really blow a hole in something that's going on in the world and get people to wake up, to think. I always remind my students, poems are small, relatively speaking, in size, boxes of knowledge. The poem is a box of knowledge made out of compressed language with vivid image textures that move along rhythmic pulsations that shape lines and stanzas. And they have a particular they have a particular pull on readers. So the poem has enormous potential to have an impact on social life and on the lives of communities. And it often saddens me that in the USA, poetry is just not more of a mainstream staple. I think we need that to happen. I don't know if we want to go out. Do we want to go out to the audience here? How are we doing?
Yeah, we can shift. I was going to,
I don't want to interrupt you. You keep going.
I just have one question and then we're going to shift. I know Tatevik said there's some questions from on Facebook as well. Olivia, thanks for posting that as well, the poem. I just wanted to say, now that we're here, is there something maybe we can just sort of say about kind of where we're at? And so much of your work and time, content-wise, maybe not aesthetically, but has gone into, and it's in No Sign as well, has gone into this sort of continually shining a light and bringing awareness to the Armenian Genocide, the sort of, lasting impact of it. It's obviously it's just terms in recognition internationally early on, certainly, and in the States. But now we're here, right? And then we have Biden's recognition, public naming, this push for democracy in 2018 in Armenia, revolution, and then of course tragic events of 44-day war in Artsakh. I'm wondering where are we, Peter, in terms of this sort of awareness internationally about the Armenian genocide and maybe about Armenia. Where are we in terms of both of those things? In terms of and I know for you always often speak, and you mentioned it before, from like in the diaspora, and speaking to this conversation with Armenia. Can you just speak about that for a few minutes before we move into the chat?
Sure. Well, Alan, I couldn't possibly answer your question in any authoritative way. I'm just one person who views things from his perch. My own engagement with the density and richness of the tragic Armenian past of the 20th century was an imaginative one. From my mid-20s on, even my first published poems on, my engagement was the excitement of the experience having depth and meaning, and my challenge, the challenge for the imagination to do something interesting with it. So my own journey into the Armenian past began as a poet, making images and lines and stanzas and trying to find the right tone for the poem. Mm-hmm. But way leads on to way, and one journeys down a path and gets involved in contemporary affairs and contemporary events and politics and the whole issue of Turkish nationalism, trying to rewrite the history of the Armenian genocide. And we use that term denial to signify this process of propaganda and rewriting. And, there's a lot of scholars studying the Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide because it offers such an intense laboratory study. It's a case study of rabid nationalism and its efforts to cover over history and moral accountability. So these issues started engaging me in other ways, as these issues did Armenians all over the world. I think we have, over the last 4 decades, I've been at work as a writer for more than 4 decades, but it's been gratifying to watch the Armenian story get told in many forms, in much more broad ways and accessible and open and mainstream forums, in distinction to kind of the the mid 20th century, where the Armenian story was just an obscure, weird, unknown story. The narrative now has real richness in a lot of the imaginations and knowledge boxes of peoples around the world. And that really has made a difference for understanding the situation of this fragile, landlocked nation in the Southwest Caucasus and the issues that that nation is facing today. Those issues are many, they're complicated, and the Armenian Institute and the Armenian Literary Alliance, for example, the two sponsors of today's event and many other events throughout the year, are doing great work by bringing the Armenian voice to as broad a public as possible. I mean, the voice matters. Every culture's voice matters for understanding and community engagement with cultures and peoples outside. So our writers, our artists, our filmmakers, our musicians, everybody together is doing something more important than what they realize when they're in their studios at the work. When you're at the work, you've got to be focused on the paint and the grout and your brushes, your synthesizers, your reeds, your drafts and revisions. You've got to be focused on that. But if you can get that text out into the wider world, and if it's a good text, it starts having a life of its own in a broader community of culture. And that broader community of culture is doing something. And that's very positive for the particular culture it's speaking about. Armenia faces a lot of issues and problems. A lot of progress has been made in certain ways. And I think that's also affirming and hopeful. But the frightening realities that face the Republic, for example, are what they are. These are existential issues right now. And this isn't I have no policy crunching on the current Turkish, Azeri, Armenian conundrum. I'll leave that for another seminar.
That makes sense. Yeah, I do want to say, I know your initial response, so modest and pure, and I appreciate that. I do want to confirm that for many of us, you have been a conduit into understanding our own pasts, and which is huge. And your work has been that way for us, has been a bridge. So thank you for that, Peter. You mentioned before, maybe we could switch over to the chat. I'm gonna actually, Tato, do you know if there's somebody on Facebook? You said that you mentioned there might be a question or two on Facebook we might be able to work in. Yeah.
Well, a lot of thank yous and lovely words for the reading, Peter. Thank you. And one special one from our staff I'd like to read from a young teacher, Sona Gevorkian, who says, "Greeting, Mr. Balakian. Sincere thanks and greetings from our staff. Currently reading your work and so great to be connected to you through this conversation. A little heart there. And many thanks, and Chorek and Grandma touched me so much. Shnorakalem."
Thank you.
We're getting such a wonderful sense of community because people have joined us from our staff to America. So it's beautiful to be here. We have a question, a few comments from Pedros Apean, who asked any young poet in Armenia or the diaspora we should look out for that you have come across?
One thing that I feel badly about personally, because I don't read Armenian, my knowledge of the literary work going on in Armenia is small. And I think one of the most important things we can do, and those of you in this conversation, I know, have thought about this, and we should be spending more time working on this, is the process of translation. Not only translation, but getting books by Armenian writers who write in Armenian into English, in Artsakh, in the Republic, and in the Western Armenian diaspora, whether they're writing in Aleppo or Beirut or Nicosia or wherever, Istanbul. We need more of, we need this to start happening in a very serious way. And we also need the other to happen, I think, although you'll tell me, we need to get books written by diasporan writers in English or French or Spanish into Armenian. We need good translators. And we probably as a community globally, there is great need for a kind of institute for translation. It has to be well funded. There have to be a team of translators who are highly regarded and vetted. And there has to be real money to pay them. They have to have careers doing it. So I guess I'd like to focus on that as my answer to, there are a lot of good young Armenian writers out there in various generations, and they're easy to find on the internet. And what we need to do is get a translation flow happening.
Well, I will jump in here and say that IALA is launching its first translation grant this summer, and Tatevik has been guiding us through that as part of our translation committee. I wanted to actually ask a question myself, if that's okay. Peter, I noticed at the end of your collection you note sources. And one of those is Elizabeth Kolbert's Sixth Extinction. I've been actually recently reading her Under a White Sky, her most recent book. And I wanted to ask you about, because your long poem, No Sign, engages with sort of the environment of the Palisades and going back thousands of years to creation, and I wanted to ask you, since you are a grandfather now, how you are using poetry to engage with the climate crisis, and if you plan to do more of that.
Well, again, I suppose, thank you, Olivia. I suppose it gets back to Alan's question about what witness might mean, and my response that poets, like all artists, are often engaged in the urgent issues of their time. The fate of the planet is an urgent issue. There can't be one perhaps more urgent, except for nuclear war, which isn't, which also gets into my poem, because my poem deals with Hiroshima. And I would just note that my previous book, Ozone Journal, the title of which signifies the erosion of the ozone, and a whole part of that 45-section poem also was engaging climate crisis. So it's become a kind of ubiquitous preoccupation of mine, and it filters into the work as it filters. You know, you never want to You don't want to become didactic. You just want the stuff to filter into your work as it makes good art, as you can make good art out of it. So it's a terrifying fact. And again, we happen to have a political party in this country that can't accept reality, that has to lie about climate science for all kinds of horrible, dishonest reasons, much of which are bound up in greed. But these denialisms coming out of our own American culture remind us of one of the functions of poetry and all art, and that is probing what's true, not flinching, not romanticizing, not sentimentalizing, not glossing over, not pretending the world is beautiful and that praying to God will solve things and so forth. But really to put your head into the mouth of the lion as an artist, for many of us don't have to live in the mouth of the lion. There are people all over the world living in the mouth of the lion who are still making art. We think of our fellow Ukrainians right now, all of them who are writing day in, day out, and yet living with war. And I'm sure this is true in Artsakh, where there are poets and fiction writers hard at work, even in the face of rubble and ruins and anguish and pain. But to come back to your question, I would like to believe that artists want to face what's real, and what's real is the existential threat of climate change, human-made, mostly man-made, male-made violence and greed, which have resulted in the state of the earth right now. So it's hard to escape that if your sensibility is interested in the state of the real. My grandchildren are 4 and 1, and you don't have to be a grandparent to feel the heaviness about the future, but your grandchildren also give you enormous hope and energy and life force, and that's exciting. And we have to keep the life force and the excitement of their energy as the path that leads us forward.
Thank you.
We have another question, Alan, if I may ask.
Please, yeah.
This is from Tamara Wilson, who says, can you please ask our beloved poet to read August Diary? It is the poem that has a deep resonance for me, as it showed both Peter and I hold the word garrod so deeply in our hearts. I wonder if it is that sense of garrod that drives our quest for capturing time and tying to space.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful. I appreciate greatly the response and the thought. That powerful Armenian word garrod, which has so many filaments, as I understand it, yearning, longing, desire, feeling of exile and longing. I can't read it right now. I don't have it in front of me, and it's a long poem, but thank you for noting it. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And Alan, can I ask a question as well once I'm muted?
Please, yeah, please.
Peter, we talked about translations, and like Olivia mentioned, this is something we discussed a lot with IALA team, and hopefully we'll start a process which will become this big dream we were talking about with lots of funding. Would you consider translations again? Obviously, you've translated Diamanto's collection. Do you think about poetry translations again?
Well, of course, and I have to just say with total, obviously, transparency here, that my role as a co-translator is not, I'm a co-translator who's not fluent in Armenian, but who will sit down with a translator and hash out for hours the complexity and nuances of the Armenian words, which I learn a lot about these words, and then how do we carry them into English. So the translating process for the English part of the collaboration is very time consuming and engaging, but I'm disappointed that I can't read the language to translate. So I would be, always interested in translating. The three marvelous people I worked with, Nivart Yalyan, no longer living, and Aris Sevag, no longer living. They were such great translators. And then Aram Arkun, who worked with me on the ruins of Ani. So I know I'm the lesser part of all that. They're the greater part of it. And how I wish I could do it by myself. I can't, but I'm happy to be there if a project is waiting. And we need a couple good anthologies of Armenian poetry in English, more of that, and vice versa. We need Armenian diasporan poets in Armenian. So
it's such a big dream, the anthologies in both directions. And
makes
what I would dearly love to see you translating Farush Sevak. There are so many parallels I see in your work and Sevak's work. Would be wonderful to see your reading of his works.
I'd love to do it. I have a small collection of his the translations of his poems published in the USSR back in the pre-independence days, and I'm blanking on who did the translation, but I will go find out when I. Yeah, you're right.
There were some by Garik Basmadjian, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right. It must have been Garik Basmadjian.
There are some anthologies here and there, but in my head, he has similar to you. That's what we were talking about, the connection between conceptual and granular and sort of this raw power. Anyway, let's bear that in mind once we start translation projects and get funding with IALA.
Great idea. And yeah, Sevag, we need more of Sevag into English. He should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And he has that marvelous poem called Garod. He has a marvelous poem called Garod.
Yes, he says if there is a language which doesn't have the word Garod, I will change my nationality. But clearly English doesn't have the word Garod. I think we're nearing the time to wrap up this wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much. Thank you for reading your poems, Peter, sharing your thoughts with us so generously, and Alan, thank you for your thoughtful conversation. And thank you everyone at IALA and Olivia for enabling this. A pleasure as always. And once more, we're reminded that we need our poets. We need our poems to be loud. Like, I loved what you said about Yevtushenko, Alan, that poets should be journalists. You have to be, Sevak himself saw himself as a speaker form for a society, especially in our dark times everywhere, with people, wonderful people like Osman Kavala and friends being in prison. I think the poet's role is more important. So thank you to everyone who joined and watched on Zoom and Facebook and later on YouTube. Two things wanted to remind our audiences as well, and Peter talked beautifully about how our voices matter to non-Armenians as well. So IALA is doing a fantastic competition for young Armenian poets, and Alan, I think, Olivia has just put the link in the chat, and I know the deadline has been extended. If you know anyone between 14 and 18 who writes poetry, please click on this link, share the page with them and get them to participate. And they get wonderful publicity. I think last year's one was an amazing success with an event which followed and publication. And a little plug for something we're doing at the Armenian Institute, which is closing very soon as well. We're running the film festival called Places and Spaces, and there are 3-4 days left until you can watch some of our films for free. I'll share a link here as well. If you're based in the UK and US, please join and watch. We have classics, we have contemporary films, we have shorts, we have feature films, we have documentaries, everything. And keep in touch with the Armenian Institute and IALA. You know our website, you know our Facebook pages. Please write, send your ideas, feedback, and thanks again, Peter and Alan.
Thank you.
We cannot wait for more books from you, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks for doing the work you're doing, and let's keep pushing it forward in all ways. And the community matters, and in the digital age, we can be together across enormous distances. So, Tadavi, thank you. Olivia, thank you. Alan, thank you.
Grateful for all this. Thank you for everybody involved and the folks who came.
I want to say I'm always happy to sign books if you buy them and send them to me, or if you want to buy them through the Colgate bookstore, just let me know. The bookstore will send them to you wherever you are, and I go in there and I sign them, and it's a very simple process. So
Your generosity is appreciated, Peter, always, from the start and to now. We appreciate everybody for joining us. We only have ourselves without you. Whitman talked about great poets need great audiences. So thank you for spreading the word. And once again, I think there'll be a video of this available if you want to share that later as well. And thanks to everybody involved. We're grateful.